Hello, good evening. Can you give me a response if you can hear me? Okay, thank you very much. So we start a new line of discussion from this lecture. Last week, Dr. Betty Young has discussed about the management of third sector housing. And from this lecture and the next lecture, we will concentrate on our discussion on public housing, taking Hong Kong as a prime example. And because we only have 2 lectures, so we have to be selective on some special issues in the management of public housing in Hong Kong. In fact, in this lecture, I choose one management practice in public housing, which what we call the Marking Scheme of Hong Kong Housing Authority. But this is not just a management issue, because from these management issues, in fact, we want to reflect the change in the underlying principles and some direction of urban management in general, which I'll unfold when we proceed with the lecture. Although the marking scheme may not be the most important sort of policy or management practice of public housing in Hong Kong, but it has some very specific sort of implications. Because with that, we can offer a window to look at how urban management in general is being practiced in Hong Kong, and we are also being able to link such management practice with a wider literature on antisocial behavior. Let me show you one very so-called interesting example. About 10 years ago, Taipei wants to expand their sort of public rental housing. And at that time, they only have a very small sector of public rental housing, which only have about 5,000 and 6,000 units. And they have long time not built any sort of new public rental housing. And at that time, when Mr. Hao Longbin was the mayor, they have a plan to develop public housing, rental public housing. So he took a visit to Hong Kong. And of course, I mean, there are many things that Hong Kong public housing can offer example to Taipei, but at least for him and for the mass media in Taiwan, they interestingly pick up the marking scheme as one very good example of sort of management. Let's look at how the mass media of Taiwan reported that about nine years ago. Sorry.
积极推出平价住宅的这个台北市长郝龙斌呢，最近走访香港，因为香港经营公营出租住宅已经有50多年的经验了，这对于要推公营国宅的台北市，当然是一个非常好的学习对象。那么台北市长郝龙斌这次到香港考察呢，看到了香港政府以扣点机制来管理住户的生活品质，他决定把这套制度也带回台湾。
40层楼高的大楼，一栋接着一栋，看起来超级壮观。但别以为这里是超级豪宅，其实是香港的公营出租住宅牛头角上村。台北市长郝龙斌特地拜访居民，了解香港公营住宅的优缺点。而2003年建设完成的牛头角上村，还保留改建前的当地特色，像是古老茶餐厅或是商店照片，都是要让老人家可以回味过去。只是走进屋内，空间却是小到不行。 不到10坪大的空间，尽管每个月租金只要台币7500元，却得3到4人一起生活。而在香港，想要承租公营住宅，除了个人月收入不得超过28000台币外，存款也不得超过70万台币，而且还有管理扣分制度，好比乱晒衣服或是乱丢垃圾，只要违规太多，都会被赶出住宅。
居民自己组一个 管理委员会，针对就是在居民居住在这个环境里面，他们要有相关的公约。如果不依照公约的时候，我们有适当的罚则，来确保这个整个居住的品质跟环境。我觉得这是我们可以学习的地方。大概不到10坪啊，那这个坪数从台北未来我们做公营出租国宅的角度来看，应该我们的坪数会比他们大。一个小家庭的坪数大概是24坪左右。
香港经营公营住宅已经有50年历史，而现在每年更以新建15000户的速度，要让3年之内让全香港1/3买不起房屋的民众都有地方住。而台北市长郝龙斌也将这套香港的成功经验带回台湾，让以上就是民事新闻陈。
Although the information get by Mr. Hao was not exactly correct, I mean the marking scheme is correct, but the marking scheme is not managed by what he called a residence committee, but directly by the housing department. And in fact, there is no such so-called management committee in public housing as described by Mr. Hao. So in fact, that marking scheme, as I'll introduce later, started in 2003. And in that year, in fact, it has been quite controversial because the marking scheme to start with have incorporated one very controversial clause about keeping pets. So that triggered some very emotional discussion. So let us look at how it about 10 years ago discussed on that. Sorry for the news reporting is in Cantonese, but they have Chinese subtitle. So for those who may not be able to understand fully Cantonese, you can look at the subtitle. I would only show part of that because that news script is quite long.
另一位一直都冇咩目標，喺17歲就結咗婚，兜轉2年暫緩執行，係自律咗。不過好多人對於新嘅扣分制幾項即時扣分，主要都係針對亂拋垃圾同埋隨地吐痰。雖然居民係自律咗，不過好多人對於新嘅扣分制都仲未曾好熟。對於部分項目更加係唔認同，好似養寵物呢一項，就因為爭議太過大，要暫緩執行。咁究竟扣分制長遠嚟講，對於屋邨入面破壞公共衛生嘅人，起到幾大阻嚇作用呢？
你咁樣突然之間嚟到輸呢個政策咧，對於我哋以前即係紮間咗幾廿年啦，我哋晾啲衫喺度，應該對公眾冇咩影響。
依家嚟計，佢成日驚人哋俾人捉啊嘛，唯有綁好少少，下遠兩步。
我想盡辦法，我都唔會，即係講到最差，即係瞓街，我都唔會俾佢哋離開。
房委會咧作為一個公屋嘅業主咧，咁我哋咧係有個必要咧係維持我哋嘅公共屋邨嘅清潔環境嘅。
早晨，辦事處㗎，係你哋擺咗個垃圾包喺門口喎，咁樣唔得㗎，會扣分㗎。嗱，而家我哋口頭警告你。
呢個月1號開始，房委會喺轄下160幾個公共屋邨正式實行咗扣分制，希望對一啲違反公眾衛生嘅居民起到阻嚇作用。喺實施扣分制差唔多2個幾星期，我哋同房署外判嘅管理公司到呢個位於大埔嘅屋邨巡視，發現好多居民普遍都好自律，但一啲多年嚟嘅習慣就始終難以更改。
阿石仔，向上望，用望遠鏡望下。睇下邊一度咧有地拖棍插咗喺嗰啲晾衫竹嗰度。邊有地拖？攞翻影相。
房署話喺實行扣分制後嘅2個星期，佢哋一共發出1856個口頭警告，當中最多就係晾地拖喺屋外同埋喺門口放置雜物。
扣分咁樣，我冇辦法啊嘛。
唔係
辛苦我係光我係收啊。
你聽我解釋，咁今次咧就第一次發現咧就會俾一個口頭嘅警告你嘅啫。咁啊希望你咧盡快拎翻入嚟，將個地拖盡快拎翻入嚟，好嘛？好冇？好。
即使係被選為清潔屋邨嘅禾輋邨，居民都似乎唔係好了解扣分制嘅準則。
擺垃圾係咪你㗎？係啊。啊嗱咁樣跟翻屋邨扣分制啦，唔可以再擺垃圾出嚟㗎啦。如果要擺嘅就跟翻個時段嚟擺㗎啦，就留意翻時間啦嚇。就係啊，就喺時段以內嗰個時間㗎，喺時段以外就唔好再擺出去啦。
對於一啲較輕微嘅違例事項，房署都會先發出1次口頭警告同埋2次書面警告。如果情況仍然冇改善，最後先至會扣分。但唔係每一個居民都認同呢個扣分制度。
咁啲衫咧都唔擺得出嚟㗎啦，啊！如果唔係咧就會有扣分㗎啦。咁咧希望你合作啊，好嘛？
有陣時呢啲嘢咧，你哋可唔可以酌情處理咧？
為己為人都係將啲衫咧擺翻入去。
我哋嚟咗已經20幾年啦，都係咁樣做啦，係咪先？我哋有陣時啲生活咧，我哋唔想嫁出嚟㗎。我哋係低下層，我哋嫁咗去後邊曬嘅時候咧，俾上面滴水污糟嘢，滴到我啲衫濕咗，你哋點樣管理咧？你哋唔好淨係識個管，唔識理。
張先生認為喺門口晾衫都要扣分係不近人情。
夜晚晾出嚟，我到朝頭早我翻工嘅時候，我收翻佢。而家擺條衫竹喺度啫，冇乜問題啊，應該係嘛？你話佢污染環境，抑或係污染先？
見仁見智啫。啊，頭先所講話呢啲咁嘅擺地拖啊，同埋擺嘢出門口嘅話咧，我呢啲都係啲居民平時一啲嘅唔好嘅習慣。我哋公共屋邨咧，譬如晾衫嘅地方咧，已經係比好多私人嘅地方咧係更加眾多㗎啦。
住喺公屋10幾年嘅陳生喺屋企種咗好多植物，由於花盆滴水都會被扣分，所以佢依家打理植物嘅時候都會格外小心，避免無端端扣分。
我哋淋水嗰度咧，我就係唔係日日淋嘅，日日淋咧就變咗啲水就落下邊啦，2、3日先淋一次咧。
但係佢覺得實行扣分制之後，公屋嘅衞生環境係有改善。
有啲拾荒者真係去拆垃圾桶啊！佢驚死有漏咁樣將逐包。
The marking scheme, in fact, was set up about 20 years ago in the public housing of Hong Kong, which just after SARS, the very sort of apparent and sort of stated objective of the marking scheme is to improve hygiene. So it starts with a relatively small, a fewer number of punishable items, but eventually it was added to now 28 items. And the operation would be like that, as described in the TV documentary, that they will have verbal warning, and then they have written warnings. And if the situation would not have not improved, they will allocate points to that particular household. So if that particular household accumulates 16 points in 2 years, they may be sort of evicted from the rental unit. So, but even if they only have 3 points at hand during the first 2 years, they are being barred from some sort of benefit. For instance, they cannot apply for relocation. And the marking schemes, in fact, would count the household as a unit, but not the individuals who has been identified to commit those wrongdoing. And in fact, in the last about 20 years, at the end of 2019, about 32,000 tenants have been assigned points. And among them, about 83 tenancy has been terminated. So you may say that every year there has just been 4 to 5 tenancy being terminated, but we have quite a lot of tenants who being allotted the points. And in 2010, the Housing Authority committed a survey asking the tenants about the view about the marking scheme. And in fact, overwhelming majority, about 3/4 of them, thought that the marking scheme is very helpful to improve cleanliness. And in fact, the approval rate of sort of cleanliness and management in the annual survey of the Hong Kong Housing Authority to public tenants have been quite high in previous years. And these are the what we call the items of wrongdoing that marks will be deducted, which is at the appendix of your notes. So there are quite a number. Many of them, the point allocated is relatively small, apart from the last one about throwing of object from height, which will instantaneously cost you 15 points to put you at the so-called verge of being convicted, as evicted. We're interested in the marking scheme because it is quite contradictory as it appears, because those those items in the marking schemes, many of them are relatively mild. Of course, I mean, some are very serious, and some are quite sort of trivial. But even if we are serious on so-called good management, those trivials and sort of non-serious sort of conduct may also be controlled. But one thing which I will expand sort of later is about implementation, because the implementation of the marking scheme is quite inequitable, because not everybody who are being caught of committing that wrongdoing will be deduct marks. So it depends on your status and other circumstances. And what is more important is, even only one family member commit those wrongdoings, the whole family will be penalized because the eviction will have an impact on the whole family. But it is quite controversial whether the family is able to control the behavior of its members. And also for many of those sort of behavior, they will be penalized twice. And I've just mentioned that it depends on whether you're an owner, you are a tenant, or whether you live in, and even if you're a tenant, whether you live in that particular estate where you commit the wrongdoing. So the situation is very complicated. It doesn't just depend on whether you have committed the behavior. And this is not just a very trivial sort of management practice, because it will give us a window to look at how public housing is managed, and in fact, how those what we call quote unquote underclass is being managed. Because later on we'll discuss why those behavior only will penalize those who live in public housing, although there are common issues in every sort of housing sector of Hong Kong. So this may also reflect how the society look at public housing, or specifically how the government look at public housing. And to examine this marking scheme will enable us to link to the wider literature on housing or urban management, because it is very close, although it's not exactly the same as antisocial behavior in the UK, but because antisocial behavior in the UK has been quite serious, and there has been a lot of research on that. So we can learn from those literature and to make use of those literature and analysis to examine our system and how our society, our city is being managed. So we will start with our discussion of the antisocial behavior with the marking scheme in Hong Kong. And we'll use the analysis that have been sort of extracted from the research on antisocial behavior and try to match it with our marking scheme and see whether it will reflect some of the issues of housing and urban management. So this lecture will be divided into 5 sections. I have an overview about what is antisocial behavior, and using the statistics in the UK, what has been the extent and of the problem and what has been the response of the government on the antisocial behavior. And with that antisocial behavior and the control of antisocial behavior, in fact, when it is applied or limited only to public housing, it reflects how the society or the government look at public housing sector and public tenants, and the way they want to control or at least shape their behavior. There are sort of 2 concepts or theses we will discuss. One is on the responsibilization thesis, and the other is on welfare conditionality sort of thesis. And then we will touch on why public housing is being targeted. And as a conclusion, we'll move this analysis in analytic framework to our marking scheme of Hong Kong and see whether it will give us some insight on how public housing in our cities is being managed. So first of all, about the context of antisocial behavior. Antisocial behavior, in fact, started from some problem of public tenants with their neighbors, which in fact started very early in the 70s and early 80s. And particularly in the 80s, there has been a lot of complaint from public tenants to their neighbors, basically on the noise. And later on, this sort of surge in what we call the dispute between neighbors has been escalated to the political sort of level, so that the government at that time was what we call the new Labour government, led by Tony Blair, that this discussion moved beyond so-called housing management, but more on general how social control is being exercised in the British society. And particularly when it matched with the political agenda of the new Labour government at that time on their approach on being tough on crime. So it started with sometimes very trivial dispute between the neighbors in public housing to escalate it to a level of crime control. But in fact, even when antisocial behavior has been a very common term in government policies, in government documents, and also in some discourse in public media, but in fact, then there has not been any consensus on the definition of antisocial behavior. So of course, judging from is how the term is being described, antisocial. So there's some behavior that are opposed to social norms, or at least doesn't match with the accepted standard of the society. And in fact, its coverage can be very big. Later on, we'll look at this group of antisocial behavior. It will, on the one hand, include criminal acts, but on the other hand, it may also include some very minor and trivial behavior about nuisance. And such nuisance, of course, they are nuisances, they're not that comfortable to the neighbor, but they are not at all very serious. And in fact, the list of antisocial behavior have been keep on changing, and the list could be very long. So in fact, that antisocial behavior list would span across a very wide spectrum. One extreme is on some hard crime, extreme behavior like drugs, or is about abuse, especially intimidation to their neighbors, which was quite serious in the late 80s and early 90s. there's a news reporting, in fact, in the British news at that time, that basically is committed by mostly so-called teenagers or young adults, and they do it just for no purpose. For instance, they will kick hardly on the door of their neighbors, which may be single elderly or elderly couple in the middle of the night, simply to accumulate them. And at that time, in England and particularly in Scotland, there have been occasionally some very serious offense that they call joyriding. So basically it's the teenagers or the young adults who stole a car and drive it, crash it, and then set it on fire. So there has been several occasions on that. So it alarmed a lot of so-called attention on the news. But on the other hand, it can be just very, very minor nuisance, like your dog of your neighbor barking in the middle of the evening, or the TV is very, very loud. So it's basically some dispute. And very often, in fact, those complaints mostly happen in the public space, because unlike the management of public housing in Hong Kong, if you have the chance to visit public housing in the UK, not just now, it's even more serious decades ago. So there was a lot of so-called vandalism, there's a lot of graffitis. So it's not as tidy as what we will see in public housing in Hong Kong. And in fact, not only were those spectrum very, very wide, the extent is also very serious. Take for example, about 30 years ago, in 1993 in the UK, there was been a survey which discovered that nearly half of the public tenants, they have encountered noise issues. Particularly about young family and children or family that are single parent families, they usually complain others, or they're being complained. And in 2003 alone, in fact, there has been over 10 million of such incidents in England and Wales on those complaints and disputes. But it's interestingly in discovering that people in wealthy area, they have higher level of complaint because they are less tolerant. What I mentioned about the 13.5 million of incidents of what we call the antisocial behavior cover not just public housing, but also private housing as well. So the extent of the problem has been quite high. Although recently, this level of complaint has reduced, but still is on a high level. So over the years, in fact, there has been some measures in containing and also controlling those antisocial behavior. So this control can be by legal means. So the most serious one, in fact, in public housing, like Hong Kong, is eviction, although it's not frequently used. But it is quite controversial, because at least in the British context, those tenants in public housing, they are in fact vulnerable so-called group in the society. So if they are being evicted from public housing, in fact, many of them may become homeless, because then there's nowhere they can go, because they couldn't afford private housing, so they move into public housing. So if the public housing would not so-called accommodate them, there's nowhere they can go. So it's quite sentimental and also controversial. So there is a variation of control in the public housing sector by sort of developing what they call introductory tenancy or probational tenancy. It's close to what we have in Hong Kong about the marking scheme. So if you have marked, in fact, you are being put in probation, because if you commit similar wrongdoing further, you will risking being expelled from public housing sector. And the introductory tenancy is for the new so-called incoming tenants, so that they have a period of observation, and if they are unable to adapt to the rules of public housing, and they will not have their so-called tenancy confirmed. And in some local authorities in England and Wales, in fact, they will try to use the a new law that have been enacted in the early 21st century of what we call the law on antisocial behavior, so that the court can issue a antisocial behavior order, so that it's just like a court injunction that will prevent the offender, so as to say, to commit further so-called similar behavior, or else they will be prosecuted. And some even can apply for injunction order from the court through so-called what we call the civil order. It's not a criminal crime, but you can ask the court to give an injunction order preventing the similar behavior to be committed, or otherwise it will constitute a contempt to court, and this is criminal. Or they used to insert a tenancy agreement or to revoke a tenancy agreement in order to control such behavior. Because every local authorities in the UK have the powers to make their own rules, and there's not necessary to have a common law or common rule for every public housing authority in the UK. So that is why it varies a lot. But legal means, in fact, usually it will be invoked for more serious, what we call antisocial behavior. For the more minor one, and as a preventive aid, non-legal means are often being used. Take, for example, it can be mediation with a third party of advice, or it can be an empowerment, so-called measures, empowering the neighbor or the resident organization to do the mediation. Or if it's involved some kind of legal action, or before the legal action, or as a result of legal action, some formal arbitration will also be sought. These are done by professionals as a formal mediating sort of process. Some local authorities, they employ additional manpower, they call the neighborhood warden, to look at those behaviors. We have to expand a little, elaborate a little bit on this, because unlike in Hong Kong, because of the density of development, we can afford nearly in every housing estate and some on-site team of management. But in the context of UK, because of the scale of the public housing projects, and also because of its geographic spread, very often there are only very few on-site staff, so that all the management staff, in fact, they control it remotely, or they are mobile. For some rural authority, in fact, the geographic span of their projects are in fact quite wide. So you have to drive for half an hour or even an hour from one corner to the others to investigate some issues. So that neighborhood warden will be on-site staff, or the staff that are dedicated to nearby housing estates, so that they can patrol and attend to the incidents very quickly. But more often, in fact, it involves not just using management tools. They will involve what we call the multi-agency cooperation, because many of those behavior, they are not simply housing management issues, because it is just an iceberg of problem, social problem within the public housing estates. Because in the UK, most public tenants, in fact, they may be out of employment. Some are being retired, some are on benefit, but many, in fact, they suffer from long-term unemployment. So you can imagine that those who have long-term unemployment, or even a few of them don't even have any working experience because they have never been able to find a job, so that they stay in the estate for very long, very bored, and very frustrated. So in fact, to invoke other support may be a way to divert their attention not to commit those so-called antisocial behavior. So that has been diagnosed as not being housing management issue, but social issues that may involve social services, they may involve the police, or they may involve the health agencies, because some of them may have mental health problems. So there is an effort to mobilize multi-agency cooperation to solve those problems. So this may also be something that Hong Kong can learn from. And these are the more factual information about antisocial behavior. But the discussion of antisocial behavior in the UK, in fact, moved beyond those housing management issues. So it's not just about controlling the antisocial behavior, because how those measures in controlling or preventing antisocial behavior, in fact, reflect a new strategy of managing the countries and managing the cities and managing the neighborhoods. And that is being captured in a thesis, what we call responsibilization. Responsibilization, in fact, describes a strategy of the authority to make other party responsible, which they should hold the prime responsibility. But with some clever means, they shift the responsibility to others. Take, for example, individuals are being encouraged in taking their own protection. Instead of the government escalating the effort in preventing crime or to fight crime. But of course, this is sort of being discussed in the context of rising crime in the 70s and 80s in the UK, because of large-scale unemployment, because of the restructuring of the economy, and most importantly, because of the introduction of neoliberal policy that sort of greatly reduced the welfare state effort, withdrawing public subsidies and many services, while at the same time introduce the market force in providing public services, what we call the public-private partnership. But in these strategies, the welfare of most people are being withdrew. Because after the Second World War, welfare have been well provided in the UK and many European countries, in which they can have protection when they are unemployed, or they have very good sort of health services through the National Health Services, so that they do not have to pay anything for health care. But this changed after the 70s, when the UK government encountered a very deep fiscal deficit. So from the 80s onwards, they no longer can afford very good public services, including public housing. So that in fact, many poor people, they cannot get into public housing and become homeless or in very poor accommodations. But because of the incapacity to provide those welfares, in fact, the government started to push the responsibility of the state, which they had starting from the Second World War, to provide good welfare for the citizens, And now the citizens have to take care of themselves. This is the general context. Take, for example, in the UK, from the 80s onwards, if you're unemployed or if you're poor, if you need to apply for social security benefits, like the Comprehensive Social Security Assistance of Hong Kong, they need to actively participate in what we call workfare. That is also implemented in Hong Kong as well, so that they can show that they are contributing to the society in order to earn those benefits. So these are what we call shifting the responsibility from the state to the individual, which in the past has been unconditional. But of course, that is very controversial. They have successfully convinced the society that is rightful, and this is the responsibility of individual who get benefit, because there's no free lunch on earth. But of course, it's controversial in a way that because it will blur the responsibility of the state in taking care of their citizens. And so that the shift the responsibility to the ordinary citizen. When the antisocial behavior measure is concerned, they have been using a number of strategies to shift those responsibilities. Let us discuss it one by one. One such strategy of shifting responsibility is to blur law breaking and rule breaking. Because for law breaking, the law has been very specific, and it also associates with a very rigorous legal process. So you need to have a clear definition. You also need to have a very just process of interrogation, of providing evidence to prove the behavior as committing a crime. But if that law breaking is replaced by rule breaking, because those rules, they are not law, they are not subject to those rigorous process and definition. And more importantly, those rules are only made by the administration, but not by the legislature after a very careful deliberation, debate, and consultation. So in fact, and many of those rule breaking or rules, you do not need a rigorous proof, or you may even don't have to have that so-called principle of the presumption of innocence. So you are innocent unless you are proven guilty. So that the burden of proof of that rule breaking is much, much lighter, so that the rules is easier to apply. So this is a shifting of responsibility, because now the responsibility of proving you committing those behavior as crime or as wrongdoing has been traditionally in the hand of the prosecutor. There is authority to prove you that you are committing something. But now, if it's being changed to rule, then perhaps, or very often, in fact, it's the offender, so as to say, or the suspect, who have to prove that they haven't commit those wrongdoings. We have similar discussion when we return to the marking scheme, as you may so-called seen in the documentary, the TV documentary. And the shifting responsibility will also involve penalizing the tenants twice, because some of the wrongdoings, they have been already punished by law. But because they also break the rule of the housing authority, so that they will penalize twice. So of course, I mean, obviously, you will see that that is exactly the case of the marking scheme. And also, the antisocial behavior measure have blurred what we call the public and the private, because many of the antisocial behaviors, in fact, they may not happen in the public space, but within the home of the tenant. So in fact, they need to open up the private life of the tenant in order to do the investigation. That is also connected to our marking scheme as well. And the blurring of boundary from public to the private will also involve shifting the responsibility from legal enforcer, which is the police, to the social landlord, which are not part of the government. Because started from the 1980s onward, in fact, many public housing have been shifted or have been transferred to the third sector, the NGO. They are not part of the government. So they should not have the responsibility to control deviant behavior or crime. Because of the shift of antisocial behavior, that have been shifted to the social landlord. Of course, it doesn't mean that the police will not be involved, but they will only be involved after the social landlord asks for help. So in fact, it's shifting the responsibility of from the public agency to the private. But of course, I mean, that also associated with our marking scheme, because later on, because previously, we saw that in the TV documentary, those who are investigating the marking scheme wrongdoing were not housing officers. They are the employee of outsourced housing management companies. But they do not have the authority to assign the marks. So later on, we'll come back to this. The third measure about shifting the responsibility is the blurring of boundary of what we call normality or normalization. Because similar to the arguments on law breaking and rule breaking, the law has been a long-standing standard of defining what is normal. So of course, apart from the law of the legal system, the medical system also will help to define those normality, particularly on mental health, because it will only be the doctors who can define whether you are mentally ill or you suffer from symptom of mental illness. So these are what has been used to define what is normality. But now, because it's shifted responsibility to the social sector, the private sector, and also replacing law with rule, you are redefining that normality. So that normative standards now is defined not by the law or public agency, but also by the social landlord and in some cases, even private operators. And one consequence of this shifting of boundary of normalization is the shifting of the basic principle approach in looking at those wrongdoings. And now it's being regarded as what we call a behaviorist approach. So we will only look at your behavior, but we will not consider your motivation or your intention. So that's quite different from the legal system or the very conventional consideration in law. Because of course, whether you are committed guilty or not will basically based on behavior and evidence. But the penalty is usually discretionary. So the judge will look at your motivation and also your intention in order to sort of assess the penalty. Whereas in most those antisocial behavior so-called rules and penalties, this will not be taken into consideration. Not only because these rules will not be as rigorous as in the law, and more important is, under common law, you have a lot of precedent cases in order to make reference on the conviction and also on the level of penalty. And the judge are professionals who have discretionary judgment and expertise to consider motivation and intention. Whereas if this responsibility has been shifted to the non-public sector, neither do they have the expertise or they are allowed, in fact, under the rule, to consider the intention and motivation. So, of course, I mean, that also would apply to the so-called marking schemes. Or perhaps before we, okay, let us finish this section. Before we take a break. The other thesis that has been associated with the antisocial behavior measure is something what we call conditionality. Because when your behavior is being tied with your benefit or your enjoyment of welfare, and in this case, it's a public housing, so-called welfare, you are setting the condition to the enjoyment of the benefit. Just like my previous discussion about shifting responsibility, when providing, for instance, social security benefits have been associated with the personal responsibility. So if you want to apply or enjoy those social security benefits, you need to work for the society. Why we think that it is a shifting responsibility? Because in the past, when the provision of welfare is being developed, which is quite unconditional, the underlying principle is people may not or should not be entirely held responsible for being poor or being unable to find a job. Because even if they are very, very keen in finding a job, they have the skills, but because there's no such job exists, that job disappear very often is the result of mismanagement of the government on the economy. And this happened a lot in history after the Second World War. So that the principle at that time is if we offer social security benefit to people who are unemployed or who are poor, that should not be their responsibility, because even if they want to, there is no way they can so-called work hard to find a job and earn a living. So it is a state's responsibility to take care of those unlucky citizens. But the changing or the shifting responsibility will open up what we call conditionality in enjoying so-called welfare. So if you need to enjoy welfare, you need to fulfill some condition. So in fact, such conditions can be justified from so-called several dimensions or several directions. When there's no free lunch and you need to take responsibility, that conditionality doesn't so-called limit in Social Security. And at that time, it has been extended to housing. So if you want to enjoy Social Security, you need to show your intention to work. So we know that in Hong Kong or elsewhere, that intention to work is just something that are quite meaningless. Take, for example, ask you to do some not too meaningful work in order to earn that benefit. And this would not help, in fact, in productivity or in help to so-called enhance the dignity of those benefit recipients. So in public housing, you need to demonstrate that you are a good tenant in order to be able to enjoy their housing benefits. That antisocial behavior control from the perspective of conditionality in public housing can be justified, in fact, from three possible sort of perspectives. One is what we call a contractualist perspective, and the other is what we call a paternalistic perspective, and the other is a mutualist perspective. A contractual perspective means that if you want to enjoy housing benefit, in fact, you are engaging into a contract between those who claim the benefit and the government who provide the benefit. So this contract will also involve your decent behavior or your normal behavior that will promise not to so-called break some of the rule that will create nuisance to your neighbors or inconvenience to the managing so-called authorities. So in fact, this antisocial behavior control is being justified because you have signed the contract so that you have to abide to the condition in the contract. If you do not abide to the condition of the contract, in fact, we can break the contract and get you out. The other perspective in looking at those control is from a paternalistic point of view. The condition the housing authority said, in fact, is not because you are engaging in a contract, but because it's good to you. Just like you are my family members, you are my son and daughters, I'm a parent, so I have to have an obligation to look after you. So it's for your own good to ask you to comply to those rules. So it is in your interest. But if you are unable to discipline yourself, I may have to invoke some measure to help you to discipline you. So these are the incentives. Without the incentive or that disincentive, in fact, you may not be happy or actively obeying the rules. Of course, there can be a third perspective, is what we call a mutualist perspective. So there's no contract, we are not a family, so I'm not acting as a parent to so-called provide incentive, disincentive to your behavior. We want you to act as member of the community so that you help yourself and you help others. So if you're part of the community, we should have the obligation to keep the rules or the norms that will keep the community cohesive and not putting others, your neighbors, for example, in troubles. So this is part of the social obligation, and it's also your civic responsibility. Just like to obey the rules that will make the communities to operate in a calm, peaceful, and efficient way. But of course, judging from those conditionality may have problems or at least controversies. From a contractualist of view, that justification will only be valid if the implementation is fair. That is, the implementation is universal, but not selective. Whereas in many cases in the UK, it is selective. It's also the case in Hong Kong, which we will return later. The second perspective, the paternalistic perspective, So we raise the question of whether those rules are in fact are bringing benefit to the tenant who would so-called commit them. Because those control behavior, they will only help the victims so that to prevent those wrongdoing from imposing to the victim of those behavior. So I'll prevent you from making noise so that your neighbor will not suffer from that noisy environment. But would it help for those perpetrator to prevent those so-called those behavior, if those behavior is not totally under control of the individuals? They have their own problems, either social problem or mental problems. So those antisocial behavior measures may not be able to help them to cure so-called their illness, their disease, or to solve their problem. Because very often involving that will involve the cooperation of other agency, or it is beyond the capacity of the agency that are responsible. Take, for example, the housing management agents. And also from the mutual perspective, there can be some controversy. Because it is not that easy to determine which one will lead to an effective operation in enhancing the sense of community, or to help the community to progress in a more peaceful and efficient way. Particularly under the context of growing inequality between different social groups, or even within a public housing estate between among the tenants. Because people in different social condition, they may have different needs, or the rules or the rules or other conditions that may help to stick the community together may vary a lot. To put it simple, different groups have different needs. So how can these rules be implemented so that they can cater for the need of different social groups? And that is exactly so complicated. Or perhaps we take a break of about 5 minutes before we continue on discussing why those antisocial behavior are likely or very often only confined to the public housing sector. And that's the case in the UK, and of course, that is the case also in Hong Kong. So before we continue, let's take a break of 5 minutes. See you again at 7:40. Okay, let us continue. Like the case in Hong Kong, in fact, many of the antisocial behavior controls has been sort of implemented in the public sector. Not because in the private sector there's no such behavior, but because in the private sector, if you want to implement those antisocial behavior, so control measures, you need usually to involve the police or government agency. Whereas in public housing sectors, because you have a social landlord who own those housing units, and usually they have the rental contract with the tenants, and also they have regular housing management staff. So it's easier to shift the responsibility from the public agency, the law enforcement agency, to those sort of housing management agents, and also the social landlord. So also, of course, that's also the case in Hong Kong. So in fact, when you want to single out the public tenant as a so-called the focus of antisocial behavior control, in fact, the government, at least in the UK context is concerned, want to shift the perception of the public in looking at public housing. Or in the other way, they will try to portray an image that public housing is an area of pogrom, because that is intentional. So it's also similar to what the Hong Kong government have been doing. But the UK government, or even worse, is in the United States government. They want to portray public housing as a least favorable so-called tenure, so that the demand for public housing will not grow. Because the context is, for both the UK and the USA, they want to control their expenditure, their investment in public housing in order to save money. In fact, you need to define so-called antisocial behavior in public housing as social pogroms. So, borrowing from the research in how social pogroms are defined, there could be some conditions. So we are not looking at why the government want to do that. We want to describe how the government is so successful in focusing the public's attention on antisocial behavior in public housing. Although those antisocial behavior could also be found in the private housing sector. The research on the formulation of social pogroms have sort of arrived in some elements that are essential to the creation of social pogroms. But here I may have to sidetrack a little bit. Why I said the creation of social pogrom. In fact, whether a pogrom is a pogrom have little to do with the issue per se. It's more to do with how we define it as a pogrom. So a pogrom is something that you can have a solution. If there's a problem, there's no solution, this problem will not be defined as a problem. Because if this is a problem, you are pushing for a solution. So take for a simple example, as we always quote, everybody wants everybody have to die. But death is not a problem. Everybody has to die, so it is not a social problem because there's nothing you can do on that. But perhaps crime is a problem because you are still thinking about that. If I can control the behavior, I may be able to get rid of crime, or at least to do something to prevent crime. Or of course, whether it can be prevented or it can be cured is also something of controversy. So in fact, that also applies to social problem. Some problem that are experienced by people in the society, they will be defined as social problem only when you have that definition. So in creating a problem as a social problem, at least you need to do three things nearly at the same time. One is you need to create a convincing narrative to describe the issue as a problem. But that's not enough, because if that is enough, the mass media will be the makers of all those social problems. But of course, I mean, they are important agents in pushing that. But at least you need other conditions, because you also need a coalition of support. And the third condition is you need to have some institutional means. Because I just sidetrack a little bit in saying that you need to define an issue as a problem. That is a social definition. So when this antisocial behavior is already a widespread problem, but it doesn't just limit to the public housing sector. But because public housing sector at that time in the UK and increasingly in Hong Kong has been portrayed and defined as problematic. Take, for example, we very often discuss about public housing. Is public housing are increasingly for the poor. So we may have the statistics on how recipients of Social Security are concentrated in public housing, or how public housing level of income in public housing compare with the level of income in private housing. So that is already matched with people's conception that public housing is problematic, particularly in the UK, because a lot of people who are poor, who are unemployed, who suffer from long-term illness, who are elderly and single, who are single parents families, they are increasingly concentrated in public housing, because public housing is the welfare for those who cannot look after themselves. But that match with a general perception about those vulnerable groups being less favorable, and they are unfavorable groups as well. And some of them, they can even be termed as undeserved. Take, for example, people who suffer from unemployment. So we still have a general conception that people who are unable to find a job, especially for those who are long-term unemployed, very likely they are lazy. They are not work hard enough. But in fact, it may not be the case, because I would just mention that, not because they are not hardworking, but because of the restructure of the economy, that you may say that a skilled worker working in factory for decades would be very unlikely to find a job when they enter 40s and 50s, particularly when the local economy has been declining. So business have been moved away and there's no job being created. Unlike in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong, we still have the economy being developing. And if you are a skilled labor in the factory, and now you can still work as a cleaner because you have the cleanest job being created. But in many small towns and rural areas in the UK, the jobs simply disappear. The more extreme example are those towns that rely on a single industry, take for example, mining or the iron and steel industry. They are very high pay in the past, but now the mines have been closed, the factory has been moved away, so there's no jobs in the area because no business is moving in because there's no such infrastructure for other industries. So that happened a lot, in fact, in those old industrial towns in the UK, and in fact in the USA as well. So all those, they are supporters of either Boris Johnson or Donald Trump because they simply lose their job. So in fact, that problematic public housing will match with the narrative of antisocial behavior in public housing. You are able to achieve that if you are selectively reporting the antisocial behavior in the media. And that can be the result of the bias of the media, especially for the sort of right-wing media. They want to portray those public housing tenants as so-called parasites of state welfare, and they are lazy. They do not attend school. They are not keen to find a job, so they shouldn't receive such level of benefit. But very often it's the selective release of information of the government in doing that. So that if the public housing is associated with antisocial behavior, so even for those who want to enjoy the state benefit of housing, probably you don't want to live in public housing because you will suffer from those nuisance from your neighbors. So that the general public will be more sympathetic on harsh punishment because they are the undeserved sort of citizens who enjoy the free lunch of housing benefits. The same condition is, even if you have the narrative, one single hand cannot make a big crab, so that you need a coalition of support. Because you need additional resources in launching the narrative, and also at the same time, many agencies who work in public housing need those additional resources when the country are facing problem of austerity. So the reduction of public spending make those agencies to rely on subvention from the government suffer. So particularly social landlord. When the social landlord have received less subsidy from the government, they need to have additional resources. It so happened that in the 90s, the Labour Party, they are re-elected after a decade long in opposition. They want to invoke new approach, trying to be tough on crime, so that they inject new resources on measures that fight crime. So part of these antisocial behavior are overlapping with the crime, and particularly about sex offender at that time. And the social welfare. Sorry for that. Yeah. Someone forgot to unmute themselves. So also at the same time, the government want to inject money into community health so that they can ease the burden from the medical services. So to combine with that, in fact, social landlord will like to benefit from those additional resources. So they become the supporter of the government in antisocial behavior, so that they are very willing to take up new responsibility that is associated with the control of antisocial behavior. The third condition is about institutional means. If I just mentioned that you need a supporter, but those supporters would also need the institutional capacity to implement that. The social landlord is, of course, the most obvious sort of candidate for those institutions that have the capacity, the manpower, the connection, and also the infrastructure to implement the antisocial behavior. They only has to do is to reprioritize their effort, so that with reprioritizing the problems, they can change the management practice so as to put more energy and more manpower on the control of antisocial behavior. And in this respect, in fact, many social landlords, they are very willing to take up the roles as coordinator of multi-agency strategies in controlling antisocial behavior, so that they are able to get more resources. It's easy for them because they already have the management tools and channels to contact with their tenants. A most important tools they have is their registration of their tenants. So they get all the information about the composition, the backgrounds of the tenants, so that it's very easy for them to implement such antisocial behavior measures, and at the same time, coordinate multi-agency efforts in controlling and also mitigating those issues. But why target at public housing? Of course, I just mentioned that you have the very convenient institutional means, but it doesn't mean that the private housing do not have those institutional means. But they targeted public housing because public housing has already been portrayed as a place of poverty in the 1970s and 90s, after a long period of what we call residualization, as a result of selling off good public housing to better off tenants. So that those who are unable to buy their own public housing unit, or those newcomers to public housing, they are by definition poor. So that it's easy for the government to implement that. And of course, I've just also mentioned that public housing is already an existing institution for intervention, because public housing itself is already a result of policy intervention created by policy and under full control of the government. If we use these conditions or perspective in looking at the marking schemes, we may generate some insight. Although there are no sort of serious research on the marking scheme on the implementation. So it's perhaps some very preliminary and very initial analysis of the marking schemes. I know that many of you, in fact, you are involved in the management of public housing for very long. Or perhaps you can have some first-hand information. So welcome your comments or your suggestion or objection to the following, so my initial analysis of the marking scheme. Because the marking scheme, in fact, creates some paradox. Because the pawn schemes, in fact, is not new in Hong Kong. But it had, because, for instance, in so-called offense that involve traffic, we have the pawn scheme. So that if you accumulate a certain points, then you will be subject to heavier penalty. But the basic principles of implementing the pawn schemes as a penalty, in fact, is trying to spot what we call the recidivists, those who commit the same offense repeatedly, so that they do not show any sign, so-called, of guiltiness and also of regret. So they are, at the end, they are unable to change the behavior. So those offenses, they have to be accumulated. But all those offenses on their own are punishable. Whereas if you look at the marking scheme, it seems not to fit into this so-called conception or principles, because most of the misconducts under the marking scheme, of course, is not all, they are quite trivial. So we are in fact accumulating some trivials and on their own not penalizable, so wrongdoings, so that it creates a scenario that the trivial misconducts will accumulate into serious penalty. It seems not to fit into our general principle about accumulation of penalty. And more important is, in some of the misconducts prescribed in the marking scheme, you have double penalty. Because if you throw objects from height, you will be prosecuted and will be sort of penalized by law. But you have to penalize twice under the marking scheme. And also the handling is inequitable. Because if you are in a what we call a TPS estate, the tenant purchase scheme estate, so that some tenants, they have bought their own public housing unit to become owner, whereas some of the neighbors may remain public tenants. So it's a mixed tenancy in those what we call TPS estate. If you are an owner, even if you are being caught of committing them, the housing department can do nothing on you. You will not be deducting marks, and you have no consequences. Of course, unless those penalty is an offense in law. Take, for example, littering, throwing object from height. But if you hang your clothes in the corridors, you will not be prosecuted by the court. So that you have no penalty. So it's inequitable handling, even if similar tenants of similar, residents of similar backgrounds commit the same behavior. And more interestingly, even if you're a public tenant, if you do not do that behavior in your own estate, but in other estates, you will have no consequence. Your marks will not be deducted. So there are some very apparent so-called inequities of that implementation of rules, but still it gets a very high approval rate. It seems that the tenants are not aware of this inequity. Of course, the housing authority will not so-called proactively publicize those inequity. More important, with the survey in 2010 of that high approval rate, the young, the educated, and also the locally born, they support more of those so-called practices. So there is something intriguing. And also for the marking scheme, it has signs of responsibilization, because it started with hygiene concern. But in fact, the later addition of items go beyond hygiene concern. Take, for example, the misuse of the housing unit. So it appears to be signifying the beginning of a responsibilization trend, pushing the responsibility from the housing authority to the tenant. So even without the marking schemes, in fact, the housing department staff or the outsourced property management agents should have the responsibility to manage and control. So what I've just said, we just saw in the TV documentary, that man who hang the clothes in the corridors, he just said that he had been doing it for decades. But in the past, nobody will interfere into that. So apparently it's some kind of mismanagement, because the rule haven't changed. Because the marking scheme does not introduce new rules. It only introduces an accumulation of wrongdoings so that heavier penalty can be imposed. So it's supposed the rule should be there. But at least in the past, there's no implementation. But in fact, there could be some implementation even without the marking schemes. Because in the process, they may be blurring the rules and the law breaking. Because now, with the marking schemes, you do not have to have very rigorous proof. And more important is, there's no system of appeal within the marking scheme. So the say of the housing authority or the housing department is final. You cannot appeal like in the legal system. And you also would not have the fair chance of being represented, or you have the right, in fact, to debate with the housing department that's the prosecutor for such offense. So you cannot defend your wrongdoing in such that. You can only explain, but there's no objective judgment on that, because the prosecutor is also the judge. So in fact, this blurring of the rule and law on breaking is quite obvious. So it's also a shifting of responsibility, because it's the minor rules, in fact, stand alone, they can be punishable. But some are minor offense, which is not punishable, but if they accumulate, it can become a big penalty. It seems it lacked the basic justification of that. And on the imposition of the penalties, in fact, you take the family as a unit. Disregard the difficulties of some families in controlling the behavior of their member. They have been brought forward, in fact, in the debate, but in fact, it's been ignored. Of course, I mean, the housing department can rationalize it as they can exercise some discretion, but we don't know, because we do not have that. So the case, but in fact, you're intruding into family relations with that. And of course, the behaviorist approach is very obvious, because unlike in the legal system, the intention and the motivation will not be counted, because there's no venue you can hear that. And the marking scheme will also set conditionality. But in fact, those justification of conditionality has their own problem. So if this is a contractualist, so why in the TPS estates or estate managed by the property management agent, the implementation are not the same? And it's also an inequity between the commitment of the wrongdoing in their own estate and in other estate, because under contract, you should have the same sort of code of behavior. And also the paternalistic sort of argument will suffer from the problem of extending the penalty to family members who haven't committed the wrongdoings. And also the mutualist is also have its problem, because the the civil responsibility doesn't stand because many of the punishable items, they are relatively trivial and will not be sort of subject to the penalty under law. And in fact, the target on public tenants is quite obvious because same wrongdoings or same behavior are also common in the private sectors. We don't know about the degree, but at least there's no reason we believe that it will not happen in the private sector. I think it happened even more frequent in the private sector because in most of the public sectors, in fact, the housing management staff, the majority of them are very responsible. So they're serious on controlling, for instance, the noise of that. And also they have the capacity. In well-managed private housing, of course, it can be comparable. But we all know that many private housing, they have no management at all. So we will believe that those behaviors are even more serious in those private housing. But if you are private tenants, you commit that wrongdoings, you have no consequence unless that wrongdoing is punishable in law. So in fact, there is a very obvious targeting on public tenants because it also, as I just mentioned earlier, it matched the narrative of portraying public housing as problematic. Concentration of the single elderly, those who are poor on social security benefits, unemployed. So they are becoming areas of concentration of problem. Or is it reflect what Yao in the research would reflect that may sort of reflect a approach in what he called the Chinese legalism. On the one hand, try to impose over severe penalty as intimidation. And at the same time, the expression of the sovereignty of control. So like many rules in some authoritarian country, I mean, China is also one of them, many of the penalties in the law, they are very severe. But the implementation is extremely selective. So that in fact, very few so-called people who commit that crime will be subject to those severe penalties. But if the authority choose to, they can use the discretion to implement proper penalty within the provision of law to impose that severe so-called penalty. Just to show that the authority has full control. So is it the case? I think we need more research to review that. So as a quick summary, so we introduced marking scheme as an example, not because the marking scheme is the most important policy in the public sector, but because if we select some management issues in public housing, the marking scheme is one very special and interesting scheme that will reflect not just how we manage public housing, but in fact how the government manage the city and reflect some new trend in policy making and implementation. And it also enables us to link up with the vast literature on the study of antisocial behavior in the UK, so that we can discuss some underlying theses that are connected to the shift of policy direction in shifting responsibility of the government, and also to justify the implementation of those control behavior on the basis of condition of enjoying social welfare. And we think that our marking scheme in public housing may signify the beginning of some of such policy. So it has a deeper conceptual and theoretical relevance on that. But as I have just mentioned, I personally don't have a experience in conducting research on that, although I have been conducting research on public housing management for decades. And there are also very few research on the introduction of that sort of control of antisocial behavior. Although those research are done by my former colleagues, now professors Simon Yao in Lingnan University, but his focus may not be the same as what I want to focus in this lecture, because the marking schemes, in fact, is not entirely equate to the control of antisocial behavior. So we cannot directly sort of borrow the research concept and the research methodology in antisocial behavior in Hong Kong. And in fact, he also doesn't directly measure antisocial behavior. It's just the measurement of the perception of those nuisances. And his focus is also on a very selective sample in the public sector and the private sector, which generalization may be problematic given the difference in the backgrounds in those so-called sample, because those samples are very, very small. But I mean, he has reviewed some very interesting findings. Take, for example, one of the latest research paper he published is trying to look at the design of housing, of public housing, and the perception of public tenants on nuisance of their neighbors. And he found that in fact, the public housing design have the biggest impact on perception of that nuisance of the neighbors. So that is what I call the shifting of responsibility. If that responsibility should be borne by the housing design, so that is the provider of public housing, so it should not be the fault of the tenant. So as just the TV documentary have just revealed, I hung my clothes in the corridor because you do not have a safe and decent place for me to dry my clothes. So the design is inadequate. The management is inadequate, so that I will get my clothes dirty when I hang my clothes in that area designed in drying clothes. So that is not my fault. I have to find a solution on that. So it's not my fault, but you are penalizing me. So it's the same for noise and also partly the littering sort of issue. So perhaps I stop here, and I think the time is more or less. But for those who want to stay, you can stay for a few minutes longer and see whether any of you have has questions, or you have some alternative view because you have a very rich sort of experience in managing housing and handling so-called difficult tenants. So perhaps I stop here. So if for those who have to go and to continue with your seminar section, then you may go. But for those who want to ask questions and express your views, you're welcome to. You can either turn on your mic to speak out, or you can write something in the chat box so that I can respond to that. So perhaps I have to reiterate that the marking scheme and the control of that nuisance is not the most serious issues in public housing. The most serious issue in public housing is about allocation and also about rent, which I will mention in next lecture. Or otherwise, I would say that the management of our public housing is quite decent. compared with many other countries, particularly with the UK. So if you have the experience in touring the UK public housing, or even worse, the American public housing, you can instantaneously realize how good our management is. Of course, we may have some very cooperative public tenants. But of course, some of you may not agree with that, because many public tenants are now very difficult. But private owner are even more difficult. So it may not be the problem with the tenants, but because of the changing attitude of people of Hong Kong. So I'm not quite sure about the situation in mainland China, because I have not been to some so-called real public housing in mainland China. I only visited some public housing. In fact, they are not at all public housing for the poor. Many of those public tenants, so-called public tenants, in fact, they are middle class or even professional families. That is quite common in many big cities in China. Okay, I stop sharing and see whether any of you have any problem, any questions you want to raise. Okay, if not, you can still send me an email. If you have questions, you have some disagreement with my analysis, and you're welcome to. So if nobody has questions, perhaps I end this section here, and I'll see you next week.